September 30th, 1984, the Miami Dolphins versus the St. Louis Cardinals. Dan Marino dropped back, scanned the field, and released the football. The ball was out of his hand before the pass rushers even got close. Touchdown. He did it again. Touchdown, and again, touchdown. By the end of that game, Dan Marino had thrown for 429 yards and 5 touchdowns. The Cardinals' defense never had a chance. Nobody had a chance that season. But here's what's terrifying. That wasn't even his best game. That wasn't even close to his best game. Because in 1984, Dan Marino did something that no quarterback had ever done before. Something that people said was impossible. He threw for 5,084 yards and 48 touchdowns, in an era when defenses could literally assault receivers, in an era when quarterbacks got destroyed on every play. Numbers so ridiculous that they stood as records for over 20 years, and he did it all in his second season. Let that sink in. His second season, 23 years old, and he was already the most dangerous player in professional football. But here's what made Dan Marino truly dangerous. It wasn't just the numbers. It wasn't just the arm strength. It was how fast he could destroy you. Dan Marino had the quickest release the NFL has ever seen. Before or since, the ball was out of his hand before defenders could react, before pass rushers could get home, before safeties could break on the route. By the time you realized what was happening, the ball was already in the air, already on its way to the end zone, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. Now I'm going to tell you something that will blow your mind, and it explains why Dan Marino might be the most tragic figure in NFL history. But I'll get to that in a moment. First, let me show you how a kid from Pittsburgh became the most feared quarterback on the planet. You know what's crazy? Dan Marino never ran a complex offense. He didn't need to. He didn't have elite speed. He wasn't mobile. He couldn't escape the pocket and make plays with his legs, like the quarterbacks you see today. Dan Marino stood in that pocket like a statue and picked defenses apart with surgical precision. How do you stop a quarterback who gets rid of the ball faster than any human being who ever played the game? I'll tell you the answer. You don't. You just try to survive. You just pray he has an off day. And Dan Marino rarely had off days. Dan Marino grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a blue-collar kid from a blue-collar town, Oakland neighborhood. His father worked as a delivery truck driver. Dan learned toughness on those Pittsburgh streets. He learned that nothing was given to you. Everything was earned. He played his college ball at Pitt, right in his hometown, where he became one of the most prolific passers in school history. He threw for over 8,000 yards in his college career. He finished 4th in the Heisman Trophy, voting his junior year. Every NFL scout knew Dan Marino could throw the football better than anyone in the draft. But when the 1983 draft came around, something strange happened, something that would haunt 26 NFL franchises for the next 2 decades. Quarterback after quarterback came off the board. John Elway went first overall to the Colts. Todd Blackledge went to the Chiefs. Jim Kelly went to the Bills. Tony Eason went to the Patriots. Ken O'Brien went to the Jets. 6 quarterbacks were selected before Dan Marino. 6. The most talented passer in the draft fell to the 27th pick. 27. The Miami Dolphins couldn't believe their luck. The best pure passer in the draft, available in the late first round. Why did Marino fall? There were rumors, whispers about his personal life, questions about his decision-making, concerns that maybe he wasn't a leader. None of it mattered once he stepped on an NFL field. Not one bit, because Dan Marino was about to make every team that passed on him look foolish. His rookie season, he threw for 2,210 yards and 20 touchdowns in just 11 games as a starter. 11 games. The Dolphins made the playoffs. Marino was named to the Pro Bowl, and that was just the appetizer. What he did the following year changed quarterback play forever. And I mean forever. Now here's where the story gets unbelievable. Pay close attention to these numbers, because you're about to understand why defensive coordinators had nightmares about this man. 1984, the greatest passing season in NFL history at that time. Dan Marino threw for 5,084 yards. He threw 48 touchdown passes. 48, in an era when passing wasn't what it is today. In an era when defensive backs could mug receivers at the line of scrimmage. In an era when hitting the quarterback was not just allowed but encouraged, celebrated even. Dan Marino put up video game numbers in a league that was designed to stop the passing game. Let me put those numbers in perspective, because I don't think you understand how insane this was. In 1984, the average NFL team threw for about 3,200 yards per season. Dan Marino threw for nearly 2,000 more than average. The second-place finisher in passing yards that year had 4,614. Marino beat him by almost 500 yards. It wasn't a competition. It was a man playing against boys. It was a coronation. And the 48 touchdowns? That record stood for 20 years. 20 years. Think about all the quarterbacks who played in those 2 decades. All the Hall of Famers. All the legends. None of them could touch what Dan Marino did in 1984. Peyton Manning finally broke it in 2004 with 49. But Manning did it in an era of quarterback-friendly rules. Dan Marino did it when defenders could hit you in the head, when cornerbacks could grab receivers and throw them to the ground, when the NFL was a violent, brutal, physical league that chewed up quarterbacks and spit them out. And Dan Marino made it look effortless. But here's what truly separated Marino from every other quarterback who ever lived. The thing that made defensive coordinators lose sleep. The thing that made pass rushers question their career choices. That release, that impossibly quick release. Football analysts have tried to measure it over the years. Some estimates say Marino could release the ball in under 0.4 of a second, from the moment his hand started moving to the moment the ball left his fingers. Less than the blink of an eye. Pass rushers would be bearing down on him, thinking they had him dead to rights, and the ball would already be gone, already spiraling downfield, already in the hands of Mark Clayton or Mark Duper. The defender would hit Marino a half-second late, and the referee would be signaling touchdown. The Marks brothers, that's what they called Miami's receiving duo. Clayton and Duper, they weren't the biggest receivers in the league. They weren't the fastest receivers in the league. But they didn't need to be. They had Dan Marino throwing them the football. All they needed to do was run their routes and look for the ball. It would be there, perfectly placed, arriving before the defender could react. Clayton and Duper became stars because of Dan Marino. He made them rich. He made them famous. He made them look like Hall of Famers. Week after week in 1984, Marino destroyed defenses. He threw for over 400 yards 4 times that season. 4 times. Most quarterbacks never have a 400-yard game in their entire career. Marino had 4 in a single season. Against the best defenses the NFL had to offer. Against teams that knew exactly what Miami was going to do. Pass the ball to Dan Marino. Try to stop it if you can. Nobody could. October 14th, 1984. The Dolphins versus the Houston Oilers. Marino threw for 417 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Oilers had no answer for his quick release. They tried everything. Blitzing, zone coverage, man coverage. Didn't matter. November 4th against the New York Jets. 422 yards, 3 more touchdowns. The Jets had spent all week preparing specifically for Marino. Their entire game plan was built around stopping him. Didn't matter. December 2nd against the Indianapolis Colts. 404 yards, 4 touchdowns. Week after week, the same story. Defenses knew it was coming and still couldn't stop it. Here's what made Marino even more dangerous. He wasn't just fast, he was accurate. Deadly accurate. He could throw the ball into windows that didn't seem to exist. Tight coverage? Didn't matter. Marino would fit the ball between 2 defenders like he was threading a needle. He had touch on his deep balls, velocity on his intermediate throws, and perfect placement on everything else. His arm was a weapon, his mind was a computer, and his release was faster than anything the league had ever seen. Now remember when I told you about the tragedy of Dan Marino? Here it comes, and it still hurts to talk about. That 1984 season ended with Marino and the Dolphins in the Super Bowl. They faced the San Francisco 49ers and Joe Montana in Super Bowl 19. 2 legendary quarterbacks, 2 high-powered offenses. Everyone expected a shootout for the ages. 2 future Hall of Famers going head-to-head on the biggest stage in sports. Instead, the 49ers defense did something almost nobody else could do that year. They pressured Marino. They disrupted his timing. They got in his face before he could release the ball. San Francisco won 38-16. It was the only blemish on an otherwise perfect season. And here's the heartbreaking part. That Super Bowl loss in 1984 would haunt Dan Marino for the rest of his career. He never got back. Let that sink in. Never. 17 seasons in the NFL. 17 years as one of the most prolific passers the game has ever seen. And Dan Marino never won a Super Bowl. Not one. He made the playoffs 10 times. He won playoff games. He had incredible statistical seasons, year after year after year. But he never held that trophy. The one thing that separates the great from the greatest. The one thing that every quarterback is ultimately judged by. Dan Marino never got it. Why? It's complicated. And it's the most unfair thing in football history. The Dolphins teams around him were good, but never great. The defense was rarely elite. The running game was often average at best. Marino had to carry the offense himself, and he did. Year after year, he put up numbers that would make any other quarterback a first-ballot Hall of Famer. But football is a team game. One player, even the best passer in the world, can't win it alone. Tom Brady had great defenses. Joe Montana had the greatest offense ever assembled. Peyton Manning had elite weapons everywhere. Dan Marino had himself and 2 good receivers. That was it. In 1985, Marino threw for 4,137 yards and 30 touchdowns. Still elite, still among the best in the league. In 1986, 4,746 yards and 44 touchdowns. Almost as good as his record-breaking year. 44 touchdowns would lead the league most years. The Dolphins went to the AFC Championship game. They lost. The pattern continued. Great statistics, deep playoff runs, no ring. Then came 1993, the injury that changed everything. The moment that made everyone hold their breath. October 10th, 1993, Marino dropped back to pass against the Cleveland Browns. He planted his foot to throw, just like he'd done a million times before, and his Achilles tendon ruptured. The most durable quarterback in football was suddenly on the ground, clutching his ankle, his face twisted in pain. The season was over. Many wondered if his career was over. Achilles injuries had ended careers before. They had ended younger careers. For a quarterback who couldn't run to begin with, who relied entirely on his arm and his mind, how would he come back? But here's what people forget about Dan Marino. What made him special beyond the physical tools? He wasn't just talented. He was tough. He was determined. He was a Pittsburgh kid who didn't know how to quit. He worked harder than anyone to get back on that field. Months of rehab, months of pain, months of wondering if he would ever be the same, and in 1994, he returned. Not just returned, he threw for 4,453 yards and 30 touchdowns. He proved that the injury hadn't taken anything away from his arm. The release was still quick. The accuracy was still there. The football IQ was still elite. Dan Marino wasn't done yet. He had more records to set, more defenses to destroy. He played through 1999, 17 total seasons, all with the Miami Dolphins. One team, one city, one franchise quarterback for nearly 2 decades. When he retired, he held virtually every major passing record in NFL history. Most career passing yards with 61,361. Most career touchdown passes with 420. Most 4,000-yard seasons with 6. Most games with 400-plus passing yards with 13. The record books belong to Dan Marino. Those records have since been broken. Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, Tom Brady. The game changed. Passing became easier. Rules protected quarterbacks. Defenses were handcuffed. Numbers inflated across the league. But here's what those who watched both eras will tell you. Nobody released the ball faster than Dan Marino. Nobody. Not before him. Not since him. If Dan Marino played in today's NFL, with today's rules, with today's wide-open passing game, what would his numbers look like? 6,000 yards in a season? 55 touchdowns? 60? We can only imagine. And imagining is all we can do. Let me tell you what made Dan Marino special, beyond the statistics. Because this is what the younger generation doesn't understand. This is what gets lost when you just look at numbers on a page. Dan Marino didn't have a running game to lean on. He didn't have elite defenses carrying him to championships. He had to throw the ball every single game, every single drive, every single crucial moment. Teams knew the Dolphins were going to pass. They loaded up to stop the pass. 8 men in coverage, 9 men in coverage, and Marino still shredded them. He made chicken salad out of chicken scraps for 17 years. He elevated every receiver he ever played with. He made average tight ends look like Pro Bowlers. He made undrafted free agents look like first-round picks. He made the Dolphins relevant for 2 decades through sheer force of will and the greatest arm the game has ever seen. His coach Don Shula, the winningest coach in NFL history, called Marino the best pure passer he ever coached. Coming from Shula, who had coached Johnny Unitas and Bob Grease, 2 other Hall of Fame quarterbacks, that meant something. Former opponents, defenders who spent their careers trying to stop him, still talk about Marino with reverence. They knew what they were up against. They knew there was nothing they could do. You couldn't get to him fast enough. The ball was always gone. Always. The Hall of Fame came calling in 2005. First ballot, obviously. There was no debate, no discussion, no waiting. Dan Marino was one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. The statistics proved it. The film proved it. Anyone who watched him play knew it. He stood at that podium in Canton and gave a speech that showed the same class and toughness he'd displayed throughout his career. But you could see it in his eyes. The one thing missing, the one thing he'd trade all those records for in a heartbeat. A Super Bowl ring, the championship that got away in 1984. The championship he chased for 15 more years and never caught. It's the single asterisk on an otherwise perfect career. And it's completely unfair. Because here's the truth about Dan Marino. The truth that every honest football fan knows. He did everything a quarterback could possibly do. He put up numbers that seemed impossible. He made throws that seemed impossible. He released the ball faster than anyone thought humanly possible. He just didn't have enough help around him to win the big one. And in the NFL, that's how legacies are judged. That's how greatness is measured. By rings, by championships, by things that aren't entirely in your control. Compare him to today's quarterbacks. Patrick Mahomes has the arm talent, but plays in a far more passing-friendly era with weapons everywhere. Josh Allen has the physical tools, but benefits from rules that protect quarterbacks from any real contact. Justin Herbert has a quick release, but hasn't faced the coverage disguises and physical play that Marino conquered every Sunday. None of them had to deal with what Dan Marino dealt with: defensive backs mugging receivers off the line, linebackers launching at quarterbacks' heads, pass rushers hitting you 3 seconds after the ball was gone with no flag in sight. Marino thrived in that environment. He didn't just survive it, he dominated it. That's the Dan Marino story. A quarterback who was so dangerous that defenses had nightmares about facing him. A passer so quick that you couldn't get to him before the ball was gone. A player who put up numbers in 1984 that seemed untouchable for 20 years. The only thing he couldn't do was win a Super Bowl. And that had nothing to do with his arm. That had nothing to do with his talent. That had everything to do with the team around him. If you watched Dan Marino play, you remember that release. That lightning-fast motion that seemed to defy physics. That perfect spiral cutting through the air. You remember defenders getting close, but never close enough. You remember touchdowns happening before you could blink. You remember a quarterback who made the impossible look routine. Who made it look easy. Who made it look like art. They called him the greatest pure passer in NFL history. And when you watch the film, when you see that release, when you watch him dice up defenses designed specifically to stop him, You understand why. Dan Marino didn't just play quarterback. He redefined what a quarterback could be. He proved that you didn't need to run. You didn't need mobility. You didn't need a perfect team around you. You just needed to be able to throw the football better and faster than anyone else on earth. 48 touchdowns in 1984 when nobody else had ever thrown more than 36. 5,084 yards when 4,000 was considered elite. A release so quick that scientists studied it. A career so prolific that he held every major record when he walked away. That's Dan Marino, the most dangerous quarterback in NFL history, the man with the quickest trigger and the deadliest arm the game has ever seen. The man who did everything right except win a championship. And that's not his fault. That's football. That's life. Sometimes the best don't win. Sometimes the greatest never get the ring. But anyone who watched Dan Marino knows the truth. He was the best pure passer to ever live. And no championship can change that. Hit subscribe for more breakdowns of the legends who built this game. Next week, we're covering a running back so elusive that defenders swore he had supernatural abilities. A man who made tacklers look foolish for an entire decade. A player whose highlight reel is unlike anything you've ever seen. You won't want to miss it.